All right, so for part two here, we're going to be looking under the church, where it says the church. Sometimes we use the term sacred space to talk about a church and its sanctuary. What do you think sacred space means? Well, sacred space, when we're talking about sacred space, it's a place that's set aside specifically for God. It's a place that it's not a place where you're not going to set up a game of baseball in the middle of a church. You're not going to do most of the things that you do in your everyday life. You're not going to do in a church sanctuary. It's a place that's specifically set aside for God, for His honor, for His praise. It's a place where church services take place, and often very little else. And the reason we do that is simply because we want to realize that when we're standing someplace special, that there's meaning to it, and that there's a specialness about it. One thing I mentioned in class would be, the reason people dress up when they go to church. Maybe you dress up when you go to church too. Maybe you've never really thought about why. Maybe you don't dress up at all, but you've seen other people dress up for church. Oftentimes, that helps them to have a sense of sacred space too. They're realizing that when they're going to God's house, that they want to dress special for Him, that they want to look good for God. Not because God asked them to do that, because they want to honor God that way. Now, it doesn't make it right or wrong if you dress up or don't dress up. It just means that that's what those people have chosen to do in order to honor God that way. What I'd like you to do is to take your Bible and open it up to Exodus chapter 3, verse 5. And what you're going to see in that verse, it's a very simple verse, and it takes place when Moses is talking to God in the burning bush. And God asks Moses to take off his sandals because he's standing on holy ground. And so the reason God does that is because He wants Moses to understand that when you're standing in the presence of God, it's a position that you should respect. That when you're standing before God, that you should bow yourself, that you should understand that this is a unique experience and that it's a special experience. And so the question there is, it is important that we respect the idea of sacred space today. Why or why not? Now, you can answer that question for yourself, I think. Let me give you my opinion, though. I think that there is definitely a value in coming into a church and seeing it as a special place where you connect with God, where I connect with God, where we connect with God as His people. That when we come into the building, that this isn't a place where we run around or walk on the pews or do whatever we feel like, that this is a place that's special, that's set aside. There are lots of other places in my life that I can be if I want to do the things I like to do. I can go out on the field. I can go outside and goof around if I want. I can sit on the couch and watch TV. I can be distracted in many other places. But for me, the sanctuary is a special place because that's where God is, and I want to keep seeing it that way. I want to choose to set it aside as a special place so that I understand that I'm connecting with God in that way. Do you feel a need to respect sacred spaces, and what would help you to do that? Well, some things that we talked about in class is maybe if you haven't dressed up for church before, maybe that's something you might want to start doing. I mean, you don't have to, like I said, but it might be something you want to start doing. Maybe it's the kind of thing that when you come into church, you might want to come in maybe 5 minutes early and spend some time in prayer to prepare your heart and mind for worship. But the point is that when you come in, you're taking time to get ready. If you look at an airlock in a submarine, okay, the way that works is it's a place where people, when they're coming out of the water, right, they have a chance to, get some air and they dry off and it doesn't get everybody else wet, right? It's the same, and it takes just a few minutes to do it, but the value of it is that the rest of the crew doesn't get wet, and also, too, then you also aren't put in a bad spot, and you're protected. And so it's the same kind of thing. When you come into church, you got to kind of see it as an airlock, that you're transitioning from your life outside to the life in the church, and that it's something, it's a special place to be. Now, at this point, we did a field trip into the sanctuary. So what I would ask you to do is, obviously, you don't have to drive all the way down to the church with your parents and everything and poke around the church. But what I want you to think about, I guess, in your head for right now is what our church looks like, okay? So the features in the sanctuary, we're going to go through 1, 2, 3, 4 there, and I'll just give you a couple of points. And I want you to notice these the next time you come in. Orientation of the building. Our church especially is actually built east-west, okay? So the altar faces east and the doors to the back face west, okay? A lot of churches are actually built that way, and that was kind of the traditional way to build churches because if you think about it, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And so we begin our day with God and we end our day with God. And so the way the church is built and the way it's oriented is actually meant to reflect that and to show that. So that's why the church is built that direction. The nave and the chancel area. So that's the area up at the front of the church, okay? And what I pointed out about that is, if you look at where the communion rail is, okay, and we're talking, if you think about the Old Testament temple, the connection there is that in the Old Testament temple, there was this Holy of Holies, this place that was set aside where only a priest could go one day a year, and that was it. And it was separated eventually in the later temple by a curtain. And that's the curtain that tears when Jesus dies on the cross. And so the symbolism that's there in our church now is that we have access to God all the time. Whereas the Holy of Holies was a special place where most people dare not go, we now have total access to God. And through Jesus' death and suffering on the cross and the sacrifice that was made for us, we now have complete access to God, so there's no need for a separate curtain or a separate space. The narthex, that's the area that's kind of outside the church. When you first come in the doors, that sort of little gathering area there. That would have kind of been comparable to the outer courts in the temple. And it's really a place where you're supposed to be able to have your conversations, you say your hellos and stuff before you come into the sanctuary. The church is meant to be a place that's set apart and different, as we've talked about. So in the narthex, that's the place where you kind of say your hellos and greet your friends and stuff, and then you come into church. And, it's meant to be a time then when you start settling down for worship and preparing your heart for worship. Now, I wrote down transepts there. To be honest, that's something that I put in the lesson previously, and I can't remember why I did that. So I left it in there just so you know that pastors sometimes do things and then can't remember why they did them. Everybody does it. But anyway, so in looking at the temple structure, there's obviously a lot of similarities. There's an altar there as well. In the Old Testament, the altar would have been used for making sacrifices of live animals. What the altar is for now, though, is it's kind of like Jesus' throne, or God's throne in our church building. Because Jesus' sacrifice was made, and it's the ultimate sacrifice, and he doesn't ever need to do it again, it's now a sign of victory and a throne of triumph. And so that's why we have an altar up at the front. It's the place that we serve communion from, because it's a reflection of the sacrifice that God made. We receive his body and blood from the altar. And so it's a sign of that and a connection to that old altar sacrificial system. For the sacrifices that were made with animals on the altar previously is now replaced by a remembrance of the value of Jesus' sacrifice. Okay? Where would you find the following in the church? So the outer court, we already talked about that. Holy of Holies, we already talked about that. Can you find these things in the sanctuary? The altar is generally up at the front in most churches, right in the middle. The baptismal font in our church is this octagonal thing that you've probably seen, and ours is on wheels, and so you wheel it out. We wheel it out into the front of the sanctuary when there is a baptism. The pulpit is on the left-hand side as you face the altar, and that is where the preaching usually takes place. There is also a lectern on the right-hand side, and generally that's used for Bible readings. And then the communion rail, which is fairly obvious, and that's where people come and they kneel before God. The reason we kneel is because we're receiving God's gifts and his forgiveness, and it isn't to grovel, just so you know. It's not like you're getting down on your knees and going, oh God, I'm so sorry. What you're doing is you're actually going, you know what, Lord, I'm glad for your forgiveness. I want to receive your forgiveness. And so again, I'm kind of doing it in a reverent way. I am coming and bowing before you, but it's because of thankfulness and because of the amazing power of your grace. That's why we do that. The question that's there is the altar the same size in every church, and what are some of the differences that you might have seen? Well, if you've gone to a Catholic church, you've probably seen that the altars are actually really, really big. And conversely, if you've gone to like a Baptist church or an evangelical church, maybe like Peace Portal Alliance or something like that, they don't necessarily have an altar at all. And a lot of that revolves around, interestingly, the way that the Lord's Supper is given. And we're going to talk about that more in later lessons. But there's a difference in the belief system there. And it's reflected then in the size of the altar. So the altars aren't always the same size. And it's not like there is a right or wrong size. It's just that they're not always the same size. So for this part, the conclusion is this. How does knowing about sacred space affect how we worship? And does it affect how we worship at all? Now you can answer that however you want. I think that the answer is we should feel a difference. We should feel the value of it. We should have a sense of sacred space, because if we don't, we're missing out on something ourselves. We've given something up if that's the case. So that's the conclusion of this part, and now we'll go on to part 3, in which we'll talk about the Apostles' Creed.